Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. Today we are continuing making our way through the book, Climate Obstruction, a Global Survey. And good news, this book is now officially out and available for free download. We'll stick a link in the show notes and on the website. Today, I'm joined by Jen Schneider at Boise State University and Gregory Trencher from Kyoto University to talk about the coal, utilities, and transportation industries. So we talked last time about the fossil fuel industry and the role that it has played in obstructing climate policy at the global level, but it's not the only industry that is working to do that. And today we're going to dig into three more. All three of these industries have mounted efforts to stop governments from regulating emissions or transitioning to cleaner energy. And a lot of times they kind of dovetail with each other. So coal, for example, and railroad companies often lobby together because in some ways the railroad industry has been heavily dependent on coal and vice versa. We're going to dig into those intersections and what the strategies from these industries look like and how they differ from the fossil fuel industry's approach in today's episode. I learned a lot. I hope you will too.
So you wrote in the chapter about why you ended up looking at coal transportation and utilities together. But I was wondering, reading it, if you were always looking at them together or if the research sort of led in that direction.
I wish I had an exciting answer for that, but I actually have always focused on the coal industry. And I think Greg has written quite a bit about coal as well, but also transportation.
Mm-hmm.
I think you could write a whole chapter just on coal. I think that would be fascinating. But the editors asked us to connect them.
Okay.
And I think the argument really was that when you think about coal and transport and others, like the steel industry or railroad, they're very, very connected in terms of the way things flow globally. So it's pretty hard to talk about the coal industry without also talking about the trains that carry coal, for example. So coal's futures are connected to the railroad's futures. And so I think it made sense sort of from a logical perspective to think about them as connected. And then as we were writing, Greg, it just became clearer and clearer that so many of them were kind of borrowing ideas from each other, or some of them had shared kind of front groups or shared strategies for speaking about climate change or climate policy.
I agree, yeah. And I think if you went looking for the links across these sectors or these industries, you would find them. But I think it's just like a habit of a lot of researchers to sort of focus on particular silos. So I think there's a lot of people that sort of identify themselves as coal researchers, and they don't really sort of do research on the transportation industry. I myself have been doing research on transportation and coal separately, but we've had very few occasions, I think, to look at these from that more of a macro picture. So I think the chapter provided this.
I was actually like, wow, I never thought of these things as being linked, but there were so many connections between all of them. Even just the thing about trains and coal, it's like, of course, I've thought about that a little bit, but I don't know. The railroad industry always sort of gets a pass on this stuff because we think it's just like romantic train travel and not, chemicals and coal.
Yeah, until there's an accident or something, and then people will pay attention to things like that.
Yeah. This is a struggle for any book, but especially climate right now. How much do you feel like the research has changed even just in the last 6 months, especially around coal? Not that it was dying before, as you point out, but even more so, it seems like it's come roaring back. How much is the landscape changing in which these tactics are being deployed?
Well, I can maybe speak in the U.S. context. So I think in the United States, the challenge for scholars is that on the one hand, there might be federal rhetoric or executive actions that point towards, say, the president's values or the new administration's values. But then there's reality, a lot of which I think is determined by industry and by economic trends. So, for example, I think during the first Trump administration, President Trump really argued that he was going to bring the coal industry back, that it would come roaring back. That was part of the sort of Make America Great Again promise.
Yeah.
But the coal industry was facing such serious economic headwinds that just wasn't going to be possible. So I think you can see new investments in things like the coal industry or movements away from electric cars, sort of in terms of the rhetoric. Will industry, sort of spin on a dime and match that? It certainly takes its cues from those political winds that are blowing. But I think it takes a lot longer for us to see actual infrastructure change in the long term because those systems are really big and complicated.
Yeah. So has anything changed over the last 6 months? I would say that probably no, especially I think if we're thinking about the direction of decarbonization or let's say less vested interest or something like this. So to give you an example, in the automobile industry, over the probably past 2 or so years around the world, we're seeing a lot of car makers making quite ambitious targets to increase the production and the sales of EVs. So, companies like the BM Group, the Daimler Group. In Japan, we had our big companies, Toyota, Honda, making these pledges. And what we've seen actually is a bit of a scaling back of these pledges. And the scaling back seems to be happening for a few reasons. One, I think there's a lot of concern about how ferocious China is as a competitor to these Western car companies. Probably over the last year, we've seen a shift towards protectionism. These companies actually now lobbying the governments, asking for trade tariffs to protect them. This is something that I guess you could almost call a dirty rule that Western countries were criticizing China for doing this 10 years ago to protect their EV industry. And now we're sort of borrowing this tactic to protect our incumbent industries that are still focused on internal combustion engines. So this is one particular example that just shows you that even some of the progress that we thought was occurring is kind of encountering some pretty stiff turbulence right now. And then I think another characteristic of all these industries is what we call path dependency. We also have this very similar term called lock-in. And basically, these industries are reflecting these structures. And the structures are political. They also consist of infrastructure, capital, workers, people, technologies, especially in the case of internal combustion engines and aviation engines and planes. And so these change very slowly. And there's a lot of linkages across these very complex systems. And so we would never expect these to sort of change radically in sort of 6 months. That sort of, I think, flies in the face of theory of path dependency. And with lock-in, we expect rapid change to come from these people coming from the outside. So Tesla has been very symbolic of this. And now we have BYD from China that's sort of characterizing this ability to change very rapidly. These are kind of traditional industries we would never really expect rapid change to come from.
That makes sense. Can I have you guys each maybe divvy this up? But I want to have you walk through and give some concrete examples of some of the rhetorical tactics in action. Climate denial is an easy one, but where are you still seeing people use kind of old school climate denial as a tactic?
Yeah, I think that was one of maybe the most interesting things that came out of working on this chapter was that I think there was a belief for a while, maybe for a minute after the first Trump administration, that maybe climate denial was going away, right? That maybe there was a sense that, okay, the bad George W. Bush years when climate denial was in its heyday are over. And there's large public consensus now. And we're seeing all of these major weather events and things. So people on the ground are starting to believe in climate change and denial doesn't make sense anymore. I think we learned pretty quickly that that was not true and that climate denial would exist alongside all of these other strategies, which say, okay, climate change is happening. And so there's this cognitive dissonance that was happening where, okay, on the one hand, we're going to deny climate change or deny that it's as severe as scientists say. And on the other hand, okay, if it is happening, well, then we can certainly, innovate our way out of it. So I think that was an interesting piece that sort of emerged from the chapter around climate denial. I will say, it's just really complicated with the social media landscape too, to say that any sort of trend has gone away because I think we have a very conspiratorial culture in a lot of pockets of the web and climate denial certainly it continues to thrive in those pockets.
Yeah, it's weird to see some of the really old versions coming back. I've seen a total resurgence of the CO2 is good for plants one.
Yeah.
They never die.
Yeah. Or the deep state is now, messing with our weather to cause these major storms.
Right.
And
Right.
that's what's happening, so there's a really interesting, I think, evolution of those early climate denial arguments we saw.
We have this idea of like denying the physical science, so we can say that CO2 is actually good for the planet or it's not coming from humans. But another tactic that's also tackling the science is to question the solutions. And so electric vehicles have been, widely sort of promoted by governments, by stakeholders and across the world. And so we see certain companies actually saying, well, in the context of Japan, we have large automakers saying that EVs are actually not as good for the planet as other solutions. And so there's quite a lot of science showing us that EVs are superior to other drivetrains, especially gasoline vehicles. And so it's interesting that these solutions are now being sort of tackled by these companies from a so-called like research perspective. They'll cite their own studies or they'll show their own graphs saying that, look, if you look at it from this perspective, the CO2 benefits are actually superior for, in the case of Japan's hybrid vehicles. Hybrid vehicles only have limited decarbonization potential according to, for example, IPCC, whereas the major car companies over here have very systematically denied the environmental benefits of electric vehicles to justify their further emphasis on hybrids as a decarbonization pathway.
That's fascinating. Do you think that's tied into Japan's anti-renewables bent a little bit too?
Yeah. So the renewables situation, I guess, is a bit complex in Japan. I would say that now Japan is not really anti-renewables. About maybe between 10 to 5 years ago, there was definitely a lot of pushback from the major industry associations, which we do cover in our chapter. And they were sort of saying very strongly that Japan should not move too quickly towards renewables because this would have economic repercussions and electricity would become too expensive. This would push industry away. So all this fear-mongering we see is used by all these industries to sort of persuade governments not to move too quickly. To answer your question specifically, Japan today is making reasonable efforts towards renewables, and we're actually one of the world leaders in solar. So we make very rapid progress in solar, but we're a laggard in wind. And wind is, I think, one of these very important indicators of the energy transition.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot of work to do there. I think like the United States has a lot of onshore wind, but they don't have much offshore winds, which is another story, I guess.
Yeah. And they're probably not going to get any anytime soon.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. What about corporate ventriloquism? Is there a specific example you can share of that will help people kind of go, oh yeah, okay, I see that all the time?
Yeah. So corporate ventriloquism is this idea that these industry groups, which is like a collection of different companies and, front groups, they come together, they have a particular set of interests. And corporate ventriloquism is the idea that they can throw their voice through these organizations that they create that seem like they're grassroots. So a grassroots organization, like Communities for Coal, something like that. And you go to the website for Communities for Coal, and it looks as if this is something that people in, towns that rely on the coal industry have created because they love coal so much. And so we see a lot of images with flags and with picnics and children and people in military uniforms. And the idea there is that there's a flattening between the community itself and the corporations that are benefiting from coal extraction. So it makes it seem as if, wow, if the industry dies, or if this company dies, or if this company is regulated, our community too is going to die. And so it kind of creates this one-to-one relationship between the individual in the community and the company. And that is used to create this really anti-regulatory sentiment.
Okay. I wanted to ask you guys both about these three narratives too: the apocalyptic consequences for industry, technological optimism, and fossil fuel solutionism, and the right to develop and energy poverty. And like just picking one, if there's like a story you've come across that really illustrates it, or like an ad you've seen that illustrates it.
Yeah. So very quickly, I think fear-mongering has become very prominent regarding government EV promotion policies. So we see across Europe, across Japan, across, I guess, the United States as well. There's lots of concerns being voiced from automobile companies that the shift to electric vehicles is going to cause widespread unemployment. And Toyota in Japan has used some very strong language. They've described things such as business model collapse. And I think that they're probably being quite honest there, because it is the shift to EVs, especially at the scale of like, say, 100% eventually, away from the dominating technologies today, which is internal combustion engine or hybrid variations. It's a completely different value chain. It's a completely different, production line. And so it is actually the collapse of the current business law. So the question is, can they do it? And can they do this in a way that's, kind of minimize the damage? Yeah. But this brings us to the concerns for workers' unemployment. And we see that this is constantly cited as an excuse not to move too fast. So I think fear-mongering often leads to this idea of painting this kind of impression for the public that the company is not opposing the direction of travel. They're not opposing the transition per se, but they're sort of arguing for a bit more time, a bit more assistance. But we know that this is like a delay tactic. So this is quite common. And I can't think of the actual number, but in Japan, a huge amount of people were estimated to be working in the automobile industry. I think it was 5 million. It just sounds like really, really huge. And I think to get that number, you have to take people working in the insurance sector that are probably selling insurance to homes and
the coffee shop down the street from Toyota's office. Yeah.
The coffee shop, it's next to the service station. You'd have to bring everyone into this so-called automobile industry. But they've used this number of, I'm quite sure it's 5 million consistently over several years, and featured that on national television, in newspaper advertisements. And so basically the message to the government was, if you sort of push us too quickly towards batteries, then these 5 million people are economically at risk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's such a convincing argument, because they are just saying we just want to go slow and steady. It will change, but in this very sensible way. It's hard to argue against.
Okay, you mentioned workers.
And I want to ask you both about unions, because they show up in every part of this, and especially around how to bring unions on board, which you also talk about. But yeah, I'm curious, what are some of the key ways that unions are getting involved in obstruction? And then what are some ways that you've seen that, be sort of turned into allies?
I'll speak primarily to the United States context, but I think it's been fascinating to watch unions kind of position themselves politically in relation to coal in particular, but also the railroads. In that, I suppose the partisan assumption might be that unions tend to be pro-democratic or pro-liberal, right? That they're going to vote in favor of sort of workers' interests. And we've seen that has not always been the case with the coal industry in particular. So a lot of those unions have seen a threat to the industry from climate regulation or laws as a threat to their livelihoods. And so there's been an interesting pushback or an alignment in the United States context, particularly with the Trump administration and their sort of pro-coal policies or their pro-coal approach. I think where that shifts at times is when it really comes down to the material realities of, conditions for workers and whether or not they're having the protections they need and getting the jobs they need. We know that automation in the coal industry has led to a huge decline in the number of jobs that one can get in that industry. And so I think, it's going to be very context specific, but those are the complications that I think workers and the unions that represent them are having to navigate.
That's actually kind of a blind spot in my knowledge, but lots of researchers focus on this. So we worked with a very large team of authors here, and I kind of feel that, we're getting a lot of the credit for their hard work.
Yes.
We've basically just had the pleasure of just accepting these intellectual treats, and just assembling them in this particular way and polishing them. And we did receive a lot of material that's far too large to fit in however many pages we were given to work with.
Yeah.
But unions were cited by many of them. And one of the messages we did see was that unions, a lot of the time, they are an obstructive force, but sometimes they're kind of being persuaded, and because their main concern is jobs. And so when they sort of see legitimate strategies, let's say, to create jobs, then they actually do come on board. And we see that. I think Germany is probably a great case where the unions have always understood that the coal industry is in decline because of, climate change and because of these other economic forces, even renewables. forgetting about climate change, becoming cheaper and more competitive in many contexts.
Right.
And so they're concerned about their long-term vitality. And so this idea of the government sort of injecting large amounts of funds into these communities to provide these new jobs or retraining and things, this actually is interesting for some of the people in these unions. Unions have actually changed positions and supported green transition packages based upon the evidence that we receive.
Well, and I would just say, going back to the path dependency point that Greg made earlier, a lot of these unions have been in these industry groups for a long time. So they've been coordinating with and part of those front groups that are doing the corporate ventriloquism thing. And so I think, you're locked into these relationships or these coordinated activities. It's pretty tough to peel off unless there are real incentives for doing that.
That's interesting. Okay, I want to ask you about the technological optimism and fossil fuel solutionism, because this is the one place where I feel like it might be quite different from industry to industry. Like, I think it's hard for coal to be like techno-optimism, but maybe I'm wrong.
Oh, you'd be surprised.
Yeah, we do have this in Japan, actually, and in Asia. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think one of the solutions that a lot of people are familiar with is carbon capture and storage, CCS.
Of course, yeah.
But what's happened recently is that all across Asia, like countries like, say, Vietnam and Indonesia especially, but also countries like India, China as well, we have these very young coal-fired power plants. And so if these countries were to be serious about transitioning towards renewables, we're going to have to write these off before the end of their economic lives. So we're going to end up with this so-called stranded asset. And not only that, these countries are actually under a lot of stress to supply the power for their very rapidly growing populations and economies.
Yeah.
So it's actually not easy for them to shut down, say, a coal-fired power plant, which produces a massive amount of power, and replace that with solar panels. This is a very, very difficult challenge. And so they have a very strong interest in sort of maintaining these assets while decarbonizing. And that's open to the door to these discussions about so-called ammonia co-firing.
Right.
Being promoted very heavily by Japan, but also by South Korea. And I guess possibly by some Chinese companies too. But this is an approach basically that involves producing ammonia, which is basically an energy carrier. So we can obtain this from either dirty sources such as fossil fuels or from clean sources such as renewables. And it's very similar to hydrogen. So basically we bring this to a certain country. And then in the case of ammonia, we can burn this. And we can actually replace a portion of that coal. So we can, for example, replace 10 or 20%. And then the idea is to move progressively up towards replacing coal altogether and just having the same power station in the future burning ammonia. And this is like the sort of solution that's been promised to stakeholders, public, to politicians. And there's a lot of money being injected in this now. So this is definitely an unproven technology. And Bloomberg, New Energy Finance, have looked at the economics of this and just said this doesn't make sense. Green ammonia is great, but we should be using this. We should be involved for other industries, not in an industry where we have other cheaper solutions such as renewables. But ammonia co-firing has been used, especially pushed by Japanese companies across countries with young assets.
Yeah.
It's kind of a shell game, right? It's like, okay, we're not clean right now. We're not, in alignment with climate goals right now. But if you invest in us and allow us to grow, in 10 years, we will be, right? So it's always just, it's like nuclear fusion. It's always just 10 years away and we will get there.
The same with hydrogen, carbon capture, all of these technologies. They're like, if you just build it, then it'll make it cheap enough for everyone that it'll all work out in the end somehow.
Trust us.
Amazing. Okay, so then on the right to develop and energy poverty, I mean, I see this one all the time from every polluting industry. But yeah, I'm curious for like some of the specific ways that it shows up in these industries. And then also, what is your standard response against that? Because I feel like it maybe shows up the most with coal, even more than other fossil fuels. Coal's the one that's like, oh, but we need it for cheap energy. So how does it show up and what's the response?
I mean, I really think it's sort of a co-opting of liberal discourse and then using that discourse against climate advocates. So, I think a lot of environmental justice folks or climate change advocates would say that they really care about things like poverty and inequity. They care about the ways in which the global South has not been allowed to develop at the same rate or has been taken advantage of by the global north. And so you have industries saying, oh, you care about energy poverty? Well, guess what? A good way to get a lot of folks in the global south out of energy poverty is to allow them to burn coal really quickly. Or guess what? You have folks in Europe who are experiencing transportation poverty. And the best way to alleviate that is to make sure that they have access to automobiles. So Greg probably has some policy answers, but for me as a rhetorician, I'm always thinking about ways in which the opposition to polluting industries is turned back on itself so that it kind of takes the moral rug out from under them and allows the industry to say, actually, we're the moral ones. We're the ones who understand how to fix the world.
So this idea of, fossil fuels being critical for human well-being, for keeping the lights on, for helping countries develop their economies, this pattern has been demonstrated throughout history, unfortunately. So there's actually a lot of truth, or sort of this corresponds, I guess, with the development trajectory of developed countries and countries like China until now. So the question is, should we be sort of allowing these countries to continue on this same path, which has been shown to be so detrimental to climate and to also air pollution and human health? And so what we sort of see is countries that are kind of cleaned up themselves, and they sort of paint like, for example, the exporting of coal as they're doing other countries a favor. And so I remember being in Japan on YouTube, seeing this really cool images of Tokyo. Oh, wow, I live here, And then I realized that this is an advertisement from the Australian Minerals Council, which heavily represents coal. They're sort of saying that they're exporting coal to Japan, and they're helping the economy in Japan. And they're also promoting their coal as being cleaner than other sources of coal. We're talking just about, black lumps of carbon from the ground, right? And arguably, we can say that one type is a little bit better than another type, but that's more so from not a carbon perspective. It's more from a sulfur perspective, because sulfur is actually, when it has high sulfur content, this contributes to very high levels of local air pollution, which is very detrimental to human health. So Australia was sort of arguing that their coal is, cleaner than others competing, I guess, minerals out there. And it's sort of arguing that they're helping Japan, an advanced country, keep its Shinkansen running, for example, the bullet train. So that was quite a surprise to see this happening in the context of two sort of developed countries. And energy poverty, this is a concept we hear discussed more so, I guess, in developed countries settings. So, I guess the United States, Europe, we know that's true. We have people that are clearly in disadvantaged positions, and they're affected very strongly by the price of fossil fuels. That could be, for example, for their heating, or that could be for their commuting, because especially, as a lot of people with lower incomes are they've chosen to purchase houses with low prices, which is usually further away from the work. And so they have to commute further, which makes them more vulnerable to price increases, such as happened about 1.5 years ago with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So energy poverty actually occurs in our United States, Australia, Japan, Europe. But we see that this is used as an excuse to sort of delay the transition, because there's always a concern that that's mobilized, that the energy transition will cost these people more money. And then we sometimes see this used as an excuse to give fossil fuel subsidies to help suppress fossil fuel prices, to help these people sort of, survive, which is, of course, a very, very important thing. We shouldn't forget there is a need to sort of help them use less energy in the first place, and to help bring the structure away from fossil fuel, which creates this problem in the first place, towards renewable energy.
Well, and not to mention that they often bear disparate impacts of pollution from fossil fuels. So they're less able to sort of fight back against those things. They tend to have higher pollutant levels in the places where they live. They have less access to medical care. So those are the pieces that you don't hear as much about in those energy poverty arguments. It's a particular slice of a moral argument that they want you to take away, as opposed to a more holistic picture of the complicated issue.
Yeah. The thing that I always ask fossil fuel executives when they make this argument, because they do it over and over again, is what are you doing to get your coal to poor people? And then they're like, I'm sorry, what? They claim that this is going to solve it, but it's like, isn't it the fuel we've been using for the last 100 years? Why is it still a problem if that's the fix? And they're like, no, that's a great question. We really got to start working on that more. And we have a foundation and they're going to start working on that. And it's amazing. Anyway, okay, I want to know from each of you, what was the most surprising thing that you found in this research, or in pulling the chapter together? Maybe it was in other people's research coming in.
maybe I can quickly give a short answer there. This is an area I don't have that much knowledge in, so I'm just responding to statements we've seen in the peer-reviewed literature and from our colleagues. But it seems to be the case that in certain countries, in the global south especially, that activists that are sort of trying to stop the expansion of coal extractionism or, the construction of coal-fired power plants or something, it seems to be especially common in coal, have found themselves to be targeted by, for example, a local police force, by political movements, and they've incurred things such as bullying, arrests, jail sentences. And there seems to also be cases of terrible things like murders, of renowned activists sort of being silenced physically forever. And so this concern, it's a human rights issue, but it also creates fear. And I think we can see this in the United States. Current administration has targeted very prominent, academic institutions, trying to make an example out of them, which sort of sends a very strong signal to the weaker players that if you sort of do something similar, you'll be next. And so this bullying tactic seems to exist, and it probably hasn't caught too much attention of people.
Yeah.
There's been, I think, including in the United States, quite a few researchers that have been to Colombia and sort of, spoken to the affected communities. And this is quite a real phenomenon. And researchers that are in Western sort of contexts, we're more predicted. We're not really exposed to these injustices, firsthand. We probably take less interest in them because we're looking more so, I guess, at the issues that have a strong correlation with what we observe in our countries. But there's a few people that sort of, take the trouble to visit these countries and to talk to people. And it's quite disturbing, the information that they bring home.
Yeah. Jen, what about you? What was sort of the most surprising learning working on this?
Maybe a related comment, which is just, we had an amazing team. I feel like we had Jason Monios on the chapter, for example, who's probably the only scholar really working on maritime climate policy, which is an area I hadn't given much thought to at all.
I hadn't until there were like those news stories this year about the IMO. I was like, I didn't even know this existed. This is fascinating.
Exactly. And so he really helped us to understand what was happening there. And then we could see connections to industries I understand better, coal or utilities. But there's been so much work done on oil and gas, and I think so much public attention to oil and gas, and then probably to coal next after that. But I think very little attention paid to the role of utilities, for example, been so powerful in a lot of national contexts in blocking climate policy. And then, something as a sector that's as big as, shipping across the seas, that's having such a huge impact. And it's almost impossible to study because, how do you get into those closed rooms where they're making a lot of policy? And there's so much movement back and forth between government regulatory bodies and the industry, right?
Yeah.
So just the opaqueness of a lot of all of this, I thought was pretty fascinating to think about. And yet these are huge contributors to carbonization and something that we would love to study more.
Yeah. Fascinating. Okay. If there's anything else in the chapter that you want to make sure to draw attention to, now's your chance.
Well, I would just go back. You asked me for an example on corporate ventriloquism. And I would just, the most prominent example I can think of was an information campaign that came out of a national front group called ACE, American Coalition for Clean Coal Energy, something like that.
Yeah.
And it was called the Faces of Coal. And so it was this website. Do you remember this, Amy?
I had forgotten about it. And then I saw it in your chapter and I was like, oh my God, I remember this. Yes.
Yeah, it was all of these hardworking Americans who were quote unquote the faces of coal and who were meant to represent the community members who were speaking for and on behalf of coal. And it turned out they were all stock images. There were no real people, just like
Amazing.
There was no real community organization that was speaking for coal. It was the front group. I'm not saying that community members don't support the coal industry. Of course, some do. But to sort of represent itself as speaking for the community, as coming from the community, I think that's probably the most classic example of corporate ventriloquism that we have in the US.
Yeah.
A tactic I would like to highlight is litigation. I think for people that are kind of living in Asia, just the idea of a company suing the government because they didn't like their environmental policy is just shocking. I think this culturally wouldn't happen unless there's a very, very strong reason. But I think this is just part of life in the United States. But this definitely is a very prominent and visible way that companies are trying to obstruct climate actions. Are there any particular incidences of litigation that sort of caught your attention, Jen, in the United States? Or
Yeah, I'll have to think about a specific example. But Amy, you asked at the top of the interview, has anything really changed in the last 6 months? And maybe that is something that we really see changing, which is that as the balance of powers erodes under this Trump administration, we're definitely seeing an alignment of administrative agencies and court rulings, I think. So we're going to see a less ability for community groups, for example, to push back on companies acting in ways that they don't like. And I think more likely companies being able to use the courts successfully to beat back regulation and going all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sort of allowing for deregulation to continue to happen. So I think, history will tell how intense that's going to be and how long lasting. But I suspect that is going to be one of the lasting legacies of this particular moment.
I guess maybe some people would be interested, what we can do about these problems, the solutions, the responses. And this was really difficult because unfortunately, when you look at, I guess, academics, we specialize in sort of finding the problems in the world and criticizing society and saying, here are the problems. And then people say, okay, what do we do about this? This is much more difficult. It's not like we say, we found A and B, therefore we have to do C. But it is important, I think, that we still try and, formulate strategies based upon this intelligence that we've sort of assembled here. So I think one of the most evident things is to sort of, make these opaque processes less opaque. And there seems to be this recurring pattern across the world of people in powerful positions in industry enjoy very direct access to politicians. And they're able to very heavily influence not necessarily the political process, but, the rulemaking process and policies. And people that are other societal actors that are also stakeholders have less resources, therefore have less connections and have less influence in this. So this is actually a problem that is prominent not only in the environmental space, but I guess in many areas. I'm sure it's also a problem like, say, medicine, and there must be many other industries where this is a concern. So how can we make these political activities of companies more visible? And so I guess this leads to something quite radical, which is governments would sort of actually very actively and transparently communicate who they met and what they spoke about with the public, for example. This is sort of, I think, an idealistic world, but I think that unless we have something sort of radical like this, it's going to be very hard to track this political lobbying activities. A lot of it's happening behind closed doors. And so there have been discussions about this in Europe, and I think efforts to make, lobbying more visible. But I think especially in context like the United States, where lobbying and sometimes, political donations, sometimes political donations visible. I guess in the case of Tesla and Elon Musk, and sometimes, we can assume there's other very less visible donations happening. This really is, I think, a barrier to moving to society towards these sustainability goals. And I would just like to say another thing that I think is a big challenge here is that there's also a need for government to toughen up, to be able to sort of identify these vested interests and to sort of not be afraid of confronting industry when it has to make a particular difficult decision. Like, for example, about the speed of moving away from fossil fuels or the need to promote battery electric vehicles. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that in Europe, among other countries, there seems to be less and less capacity in government for them to sort of produce their own intelligence. They have to rely on industry and consultants for, for example, modeling estimations about the effect of a certain policy. And so because there's less intellectual capacity in certain domains in governments, that means they have to rely on industry. This opens the door also to vested interests from industry affecting the environmental policymaking process. So this is a bit of a concern that this shift towards using more of a private sector savvy in the regulation of society, in the organization of the state, this actually is opening the door to allowing vested interests coming in. So potentially it's of reinforcing loop here.
Yeah.
That revolving door problem, I think, is really significant.
I was going to ask you about that in relation to the solutions piece too, that you mentioned in the chapter about how there are some differences between these industries, or maybe between groups within the same industry and that those can be leveraged sometimes to weaken the position. Have you seen like a good example of that recently? You talked about in the case of automotive that the automakers that are better positioned to pivot to EVs are better allies, maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm curious if you've seen that dynamic in action in an example that you could point to that where one of the industry groups has turned on the other and it's led to progress.
I don't have any specific examples of, one sort of actor picking a fight with another, but we definitely see competition. I mean, that's one of the nice things about a democratic society, a capitalist society. These companies, at the end of the day, even though they might collaborate sometimes, they're still looking out for themselves. So whenever they see an opportunity to trip up their opponent, or I guess to create a lead, they do. So regarding the electric vehicle transition, there are definitely, I think, differences like in temperature in terms of like how actively or how rapidly companies are pursuing that transition. So, for example, Nissan has been a case of a company that's produced electric vehicles, never at large scale, but they were the world's first mass producer of these vehicles. And so they took a very firm, like battery-centric stance to electrification, whereas other companies chose like hybrids or hydrogen in the case of Japan. And then Volkswagen in Europe, of course, they had the Dieselgate scandal that sort of pushed them to do something clean and good. But they pursued the battery-centric pathway. And so they used this as an excuse always to criticize the other competing technologies, which was hydrogen fuel cells. So these companies will sort of compete with each other in that respect. But what we've seen, unfortunately, is that also companies that have moved rapidly towards batteries, including Volkswagen, are suffering from like economic repercussions. This is making a lot of people sort of nervous. It's a bit of almost an inconvenient truth about this energy transition, whereas making electric vehicles is quite expensive and difficult. And these companies actually do incur business model repercussions. And that's why markets like China, which I guess are very large and there's just a huge demand for vehicles. And also, I guess they're just able to produce these batteries cheaper and they have more of a control of the supply chain. They're able to do this in a profitable way. Whereas the Western car companies haven't been able to do this just yet. So people like us that research about abstraction, I guess we have to be careful not falling into the basket of it's just everything's black or white, because a lot of the sort of, the triggers for a lot of the rhetoric from these companies are genuine concerns we should be sensitive to. But the thing is, they're weaponized. They're weaponized as a way just to slow the transition. And that's the concern. Maybe in the beginnings, there is a bit of, truth to some of these concerns.
Yeah, we see that in the anti-renewable stuff too, right? Where communities have valid concerns. And I don't think it helps anyone to pretend that an industrial wind farm is like some bucolic, quaint little thing.
It won't be disruptive at all. It won't be noisy.
Yeah. That's interesting.
That's it for this time. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. You can find more on this season, including transcripts and lots of related articles and background information on our website at drilled.media. You can also sign up for our newsletter there. Our producers for this season are Martin Zaltz-Ostwick and Peter Duff. Our theme song is Bird in the Hand by Forenoun. Our cover art is by Matthew Fleming. Our First Amendment attorney is James Wheaton with the First Amendment Project. The show was created, written, and reported by me, Amy Westervelt. Thanks for listening and see you next time.